last time we left off, we were talking about the American Revolution, and we managed to get all the way into the actual fighting. Specifically from the beginning where we were talking about, mobs in Boston basically just running amok, people complaining about taxes and certain acts, to full-on skirmishing in Lexington and Concord when General Gage tried to go out and confiscate weapons from these Sons of Liberty-aligned militias. That didn't work out too well for him, and eventually the Boston campaign ended with the creation of a Continental Army under George Washington and a successful taking out of the British from Boston. So that's where we left off. Also a failed invasion of Canada. But now the intellectuals will start to take over. Because up until this point, it's been very much a practical thing. It's been about, trying to end what the colonists consider unjust taxation in that. But there was a lot of ideas floating around that suddenly had a possibility of being tried. Sometimes this is referred to as the Radical Enlightenment. Because up until this point, it's been the Enlightenment over in Europe, and there's been a lot of ideas spreading around. For instance, we've talked a lot about the rights of Englishmen. That's pretty much an Enlightenment idea. It was not really a coherent movement or anything along those lines, but after the Renaissance and the Reformation, you have a lot of folks who are dealing with what was called Enlightenment humanism, which is when a lot of documents and that were flooding into Europe from the recently conquered Byzantine Empire, or rediscovering old texts and monasteries and that, and reinvigorating the study of the classics. This eventually morphed into trying to find new ideas, science, all kinds of different philosophy. And science at this point was called physical philosophy or natural philosophy. So everything was under that philosophical banner. And from the 16th century onward, you saw this gaining more and more traction. That's why we talked about previously with the general crisis, where there was this general idea that you needed to centralize power. Now, even more far-reaching ideas were coming about. So especially there was social contract theory, which in 1651 you had Thomas Hobbes, who said that that people in a natural state are always at war with one another, the war of man against man, and that was human nature. And the only way to beat that was to come together under a singular sovereign and pool all of your resources to make sure that constant fighting wouldn't happen. Now, his idea of a sovereign was the king. And if you think that he was being kind of conservative, he was saying this during the English Civil War, which he was actually rebelling and trying to say that they should bring back the king. Philosophy has a way of always initiating rebellion, and when all of this gets infused into the American Revolution, it becomes quite revolutionary. In 1689, John Locke wrote the two treatises on government, and he even participated in two decades prior, in drafting the Carolina Constitution. So he had actually already participated in creating a social contract for the colonies. And in 1689, his treatise, two treatises on government, really gave the idea of that if you don't have a constitution, you're not really going to be able to fulfill a social contract. He also gave several ideas about what that could constitute, especially the idea of life, liberty, and the protection of property. Property, by his definition, though, was a bit different from ours, because his idea was that property was something to be used to create, that you don't own land unless you're doing something with it. But that was infused into everything, and then all of this came together under a Frenchman named Montesquieu, with the spirit of the laws. And his idea was that there should be a separation of powers, that there should be, that the judicial branch shouldn't be beholden to the legislature. And he was looking across the channel at Parliament and how Parliament basically ruled everything, save for the king, who basically was like an executor, the person who said what laws would be fulfilled and how they would be executed. In fact, he literally had the power to just order executions or stay them. Well, at this point, I believe that was still Queen Anne. So, she. But you have this idea of a social contract that people need to come together behind. Then you have all of these ideas being exchanged through what's called the Republic of Letters. And this was an exchange of letters that were often printed in public, but sometimes anonymous, sometimes not. But the main thing was that these people would write to each other about various ideas about how to run the government, whether or not to rebel, that kind of stuff, all as very open publications and kind of going around their sovereigns. Because remember, this is pretty rebellious stuff. So many of the founding fathers were engaged in this Republic of Letters. One of the most prominent members of the Republic of Letters was Ben Franklin himself, who very openly opposed parliamentary interference in the colonies. But you also had guys like Voltaire and Rousseau engaging in this stuff. And even later on, people who would later on basically found what's called conservatism today, with, I can't remember his name.
Edmund Burke.
Edmund Burke, thank you. Who was engaged in this letters, but we'll see later he didn't really like a lot of the ideas. So the whole thing with this Republic of Letters is that they have a recourse to talk about these radical ideas without having to worry about censorship, and a lot of this stuff is pretty treasonous, so they could even be executed. But if you're publishing it anonymously, then it no longer is much of a concern about getting executed for your ideas. And the ultimate turning point in all of this came with the publication of a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine had actually just came from the UK. He was just a lowly dock worker at the time, but Benjamin Franklin noticed that he had quite a bit of a radical streak. And notice Ben Franklin was already one of those Republic of Letters guys. So he actually paid for Paine's transportation across the Atlantic. Remember, it was still really expensive to cross the Atlantic, and oftentimes you had to go into indenture just to do it. So this was pretty generous of Ben Franklin. And when he did that in 1772, you could see he already was trying to foment some rebellion. In fact, Ben Franklin was the first postmaster general of the colonies to actually turn a profit, and so he was well liked until he showed up at the Privy Council complaining about the Massachusetts governor basically restricting movement in and around Boston. And so when he complained to the Privy Council, who are the people who counsel the king, hence privy, they're privy to the king, he was fired literally the next 2 days later. So first and only colonial postmaster to actually be profitable, and he's instantly fired for questioning that authority. The following year, he brings on Thomas Paine, and then in 1776, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. Now, Common Sense is extremely important, not just because it's this kind of eloquent explanation on why the colonies should rebel, but also it proposed the idea of getting rid of hereditary leadership. That the idea of kings was just an antiquated and ultimately feudal, as in feudal, idea. Now, he was very well spoken in this, and it spread throughout the Continental Congress. For instance, one of the clauses in one of the lines in it, he said, "These are times that try men's soul." That's American Crisis. He also wrote a series of pamphlets called American Crisis that encouraged soldiers to continue the fight, saying, "These are times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands by it deserves the love and thanks of all men and all women." Can you guess what George Washington did with every pamphlet of American Crisis?
Did he distribute it to all the Continental Army?
He read it aloud. He made it a bit of a ritual. In fact, American Crisis will be a key part of keeping the Army together in some of its most trying times. So you have this Thomas Paine guy calling for the dissolution of the monarchy and giving really powerful encouragement to keep the fight going. So Congress takes notice, and at first they're very reluctant to do much more than declare that they're opposed to these abominable acts and whatnot. But eventually the notion of independence starts taking over, that this rebellion is no longer just a rebellion, it's a revolution. But this is a very, very radical thing. Very rarely has this happened before. We saw it with the Netherlands. In fact, there was a major republic created in Corsica as well before this. But this is basically the first time that a colony is trying to rebel against its colonial master. And so, on July 2nd, 1776, the the Declaration of Independence, written by a star team of 4 folks, including Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Don't remember the other guy's name. His name's John, though. The other one bring forward this Declaration of Independence, and it is passed unanimously by the Continental Congress on July 2nd. So when we celebrate July 4th, it's actually a bit inaccurate. Because July 4th is actually just celebrating its publication. Signing immediately started the following day on July 3rd and continued well into August. So we're not actually celebrating the signing of the Declaration. We're celebrating that it was published. But on the next screen, we'll see Thomas Jefferson was the main writer of this. He also was pretty well engaged with the Republic of Letters. And when he says, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Notice the kind of flowery language, but the very clear kind of intent that he's starting off. Because the Declaration is actually a legal argument. It's very much trying to make it that this is not just some random people saying some random thing. He's declaring that it is their right to declare independence. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separation and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So the rest of the Declaration is declaring those causes, especially the what he declares as the self-evident rights that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is actually a change that happened during the various revisions prior to July 2nd, because originally it was a direct quote of John Locke, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So you have this entire basis in a lot of Enlightenment ideals being put into action to create the United States. Along with this, of course, when you have such a basis in Enlightenment ideals, you've got to draw up a constitution. This first constitution was passed on more than a year later, because it took so long to actually agree, was passed by Congress on the 15th of November, 1777, and they're called the Articles of Confederation. They were basically a loose federal government that had very little control over the states. The states were, in fact, their own states. And this will be a source of many problems to come, all the way into the Civil War and arguably well after, because this is the idea of state sovereignty, that the states themselves are sovereign. Although the Articles of Confederation clearly state that it is an indissoluble union. So every time you'll hear a lost causer talking about that the founding fathers wanted the union to be able to, states to be able to go out of the union, they obviously haven't read the Articles of Confederation. Though they wouldn't technically go into effect until March of 1781, when it was fully ratified, because you got to get back to the war. There's a war going on. The Congress is trying its damnedest to try to even keep the army together, to find funds to pay for all of those soldiers, and to maintain some sort of unity. Because remember, these are just some officials sent by their various legislatures. They weren't elected. Many of their legislatures were elected, but the people who went to Congress were sent there by their legislature. In fact, that's how the Senate will work once we get to the actual early republic. That's how the Senate will work throughout the rest of this course. That the Senate is not actually elected, it's sent. That wouldn't change until the late 19th century. And it's founded on the idea of how the Continental Congress worked. Until 1781, the Continental Congress is basically the legislature of the land. And it's very loosely organized because they're just kind of making it up as they're going along. So, getting back to the war, though, we still have Washington up in New England, and much of the war will remain up in the northern colonies or the middle colonies. Remember, Congress itself is in Philadelphia, so that's in Pennsylvania, one of the middle colonies, and it will come under fire by the British. In fact, the one colony up in New York will become a British stronghold throughout the war. But Washington has to lose all of that, because this initially wasn't a very successful war. While he was quite successful in Massachusetts, the British will turn on the offensive. Eventually we'll get to the southern theater, where things are a little bit weirder, a little bit more muddy, trying to figure out who's on whose side. And that's also where the ultimate victory will come, because Washington turns south. But before that, you have this struggling rebellion that they're just trying to, that the Continental Army is just trying its best to even maintain any kind of territorial hold. On the 3rd of July, 1776, the British land 30,000 troops on Staten Island, which includes many Hessian mercenaries. These folks who are coming from Germany. Remember, the monarchy is from Hanover, Germany. So they're able to basically conscript folks as mercenaries from various German principalities and send them over as kind of the elite fighting force. Remember, Prussia back in the 7 Years' War was becoming quite a fighting force. Well, that's going to come around and bite the colonists in the bud. And all of these folks were under General William Howe. He'll keep coming up because a lot of his decisions actually end up benefiting the colonists quite a bit. Washington initially just keeps losing. First, he loses the Battle of Long Island, where he was trying to take Long Island back from a lot of these British who had just landed, and fought about a month-long battle trying to maintain that territory. But eventually, he had to leave the camps literally with the fire still lit and sail across the bay to New York Harbor, specifically without any light or anything, because he knew that if the British saw him, his forces would not be able to fight, because they'd already lost so badly. This is a pretty inauspicious beginning to his fight against this newly landed force, and it will just keep on getting worse. He fights several battles in the New York area, ending with actually a U.S. victory at Harlem Heights, which gives Howe some pause. But Washington, as part of this, basically allowed the British to take Manhattan. Manhattan is the biggest city in the colonies at this point. So that's quite a gain for the British. And they wouldn't leave there until after the war. This actually forced the U.S. to retreat into New Jersey, where the U.S. Where Washington fought several skirmishes until winter came on. And so, a lot of the times during war at this point, nobody's going to bother fighting during the winter. So, you often end up taking up winter quarters. Washington took winter quarters in Pennsylvania, and a lot of British forces took up winter quarters in Trenton, New Jersey. But Washington knew that a lot of this war was more about keeping the morale of his soldiers. And they'd been losing. They won in Massachusetts, but now the middle colonies are threatened, including the capital in Philadelphia. He's not too far away from Philadelphia at this point. And New Jersey is just across a river. So on the night of Christmas Eve, he took a detachment of soldiers across the Delaware and went and raided Trenton, which happened to have a lot of those Hessian mercenaries. So he managed to take out quite a few of them in the process in this sneak attack. And managed to capture 800 to 900 British troops. So this is quite a way of rallying the troops, right? Getting a real victory. Mind you, it's at a time that nobody really wants to fight, so that's why it was so successful. He was able to cross the Delaware despite it being quite iced over at this point, but managed to score a pretty significant victory. Then where are we? So the British, seeing all of this going on, they are starting to realize that maybe there is a better way through this. And so General Howe meets with Benjamin Franklin, Adams, and Edward Rutledge in September of 1776, specifically to try to negotiate peace. Now, mind you, this is after the Declaration has not only been passed and signed, but has already gone to the king, though the king wouldn't actually receive it until a month later. So Franklin and Adams are pretty adamant about keeping independence. Howe is actually willing to grant basically all concessions except independence. But Franklin, Adams, and Rutledge stick to their guns, and so the peace conference goes nowhere. So this meant that Washington had to go on the offensive again in the spring of 1777. So the Brits start sending more troops under the command of a general named Burgoyne, who invade coming from Canada by land. This starts splitting Iroquois loyalties because they have to march right through the Iroquois land. And remember, the Iroquois are this weird thing that kind of often decide whether or not a war will go in one colony's favor or another, or in this case is the U.S.'s. The Iroquois don't actually align with anyone as a singular group. Instead, the Iroquois split up as a confederation. The Iroquois had been a confederation since long before colonists even arrived upon these shores, but the loyalties were still dependent by tribe, and there's various tribes within the Iroquois. And so this is quite a momentous invasion, because now you have some pretty significant Indian allies with the U.S. And in a small place called Saratoga, a couple of battles happen in September and October that ultimately stop this invasion. Burgoyne is captured, and along with 6,000 British troops. Now, in the previous what we talked on Tuesday, somebody asked about Benedict Arnold. Thank you. And him seeming to be kind of the savior a lot of the time. Same thing here. At one point in the battle, in the second battle, he ends up rallying the troops, even though he had just had his leg shot off, and manages to bring the troops together specifically to attack a vulnerable flank. And this is basically what won the battle. But he had been having some differences with the Continental commander there, and he was actually ordered to stay in his tent, but he refused that order, and that refusing of an order is what won the day. And Saratoga is kind of the turning point, because the French are sitting on the sidelines, seeing what's going on. And this victory is the impetus they need. But before we go to that, the point with Benedict Arnold is that now he's kind of on the outs. He's not given the honors for what he had done and basically saved the Union, and instead is not given a promotion or anything along those lines. Plus, he can't really work in the field anymore because he lost a leg. And in fact, once he does betray the U.S., a lot of people have said that they would have buried the leg with full honors and thrown Benedict Arnold to the sea. But the French, especially King Louis, are still chafing from the 7 Years' War, which they had lost. And now it looks like they can finally strike a blow back in this long-going English and French rivalry. And Saratoga is the turning point. So Ben Franklin was sent to France to start negotiations about this alliance. They secretly sent their own arms to the Continental Navy, because the Continental Congress had created a navy as well, and were basically being used for raiding rather than any kind of significant action, because of course they can't fight the full might of the British Navy, but they can engage as privateers. And that meant that they were traveling the globe and raiding French shipping, and now the French were already starting to give arms to that. In December of 1776, Ben Franklin was sent as ambassador, and in June of 1777, a guy named Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, shows up as basically an advisor. He's not officially there in any kind of French capacity, but he is there to advise Washington. And he ends up taking part in several battles, including getting wounded in one in 1777. In early 1778, he returned to France to figure out how France will send troops, because in December of 1777, France formally recognized the U.S. This is kind of a big step in any revolution, that as soon as you're recognized by a major power, you're considered to be truly sovereign, at least by that power. This gives you negotiating power with all other nations, and it allows, and it kind of bolsters your entire argument about being independent. So, in February of 1778, finally, the actual treaties, both the Treaty of Alliance and Treaty of Amity and Commerce, were signed by King Louis and Ben Franklin. And so this is ultimately when France officially joins the war. And so with France's first act of all this, finally, as an official ally, in mid-1779, she gave 2 ships to the U.S. Navy under John Paul Jones, who started raiding England itself. In fact, he actually managed to besiege a town before finally getting defeated. So this is quite a changeover. But of course, while all these negotiations are happening, while Ben Franklin's trying to get King Louis to actually sign documents and working out all the details of the alliance, Washington's still fighting, and actually in pretty dire straits. So after the winter of 1777, 1776 to 77, the British, of course, go on the offensive. While they had lost at Saratoga, Howe strikes out from New York and New Jersey and starts going directly after the capital in Philadelphia. And very quickly, he starts winning. For instance, at the Battle of Brandywine in September of 1777 is the first major defeat of Washington in the Philadelphia campaign. But eventually, by October Philadelphia, by late September, Philadelphia falls, unopposed though, because they regroup in a smaller town just north there called Germantown, named for obvious reasons, which turns into a bit of a bloodbath when the British try to take that. But instead of trying to continue skirmishing and all that, eventually Congress just moves elsewhere, and Washington again goes on the retreat. This meant that they had to find winter quarters, which they found winter quarters in a place called Valley Forge. During this time, from December to May of 1777 through 78, was pretty much the worst time for the Continental Army. Not because they were fighting anything other than the cold. It was horrible winter quarters. And desertions were commonplace. In fact, 2,500 U.S. troops end up dying simply from the elements, or from starvation, because they're also not getting paid, because Congress is on the run and has no means of paying them. But in the midst of all this, in the depths of the winter, this guy named Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian elite but was kind of exiled because, well, he was gay, and had to basically run for his life. He shows up in Valley Forge as yet another independent advisor. This was actually a pretty common thing that advisors would just kind of do what they wanted, because they wanted to learn new tactics about how all this different technology, different tactics, different strategy could affect things. But since he was so well versed in Prussian tactics, he started training the Continental Army in February of 1778. This is finally when the Continental Army starts becoming a pretty cohesive unit, because up until this point, they're not much better than a militia. And they're not very well trained. Even the officers are pretty inept. This is why Washington kept losing. Oftentimes he well outnumbered the British, but kept losing over and over and over again. So Baron von Steuben teaches the Continental Army, at least a core of it, what to do in further fighting. So Valley Forge, while being the depths of despair, also has a glimmer of hope. Especially since, you have Lafayette, who just left during winter quarters, who will be returning with a much larger force. So once again, the British try to negotiate peace again, this time offering self-rule. Though not technically independence, it would be full autonomy of the colonies, meaning that Parliament would no longer really have the ability to tax the colonies like they had. So this was kind of a point where the British could have easily ended up ending the war because of this Philadelphia campaign. But the British person who was sent to negotiate it, Carlisle and Lafayette, basically came to blows over minor British and French rivalry crud, and actually almost fought a duel. So this kind of broke up the the negotiations, where where they easily could have ended up ending the war right there. A bunch of, brocious fighting and dueling breaks up the commission. Plus, because of all the acrimony, Congress refused any further negotiations, and they wanted full independence. So, with all of this happening, there's also fighting in the West. Remember that whole proclamation line? Well, this gave people the impetus to go and invade into that Indian Reserve, especially to start raiding throughout the Illinois Territory on British forts. And this guy named George Rogers Clark, the Ranger guy, ended up taking a bunch of British forts and secured all the way to the Mississippi River. This is how that border was decided, was that just one group of frontiersmen just went and took over a bunch of British forts, and that's why we were able to take all the way to the Mississippi River after all this. But with the British, with the French joining in, this becomes a very different war. It becomes a global war. For while we see fighting, we're talking mostly about fighting in what would become, what is now the United States. There would be fighting in Britain, Gibraltar, Africa, India, South America, the Caribbean. This is basically a world war. As soon as the French join in, suddenly the alignments shift and you start having money coming from Russia, you have Spain eventually joining in. All of this basically becomes a war against the British, the world against the British. And so if you ever talk to British people about the American War of Independence, a lot of them will actually point out that they didn't exactly lose because they were fighting a war against the rest of the world. It was an existential threat to their empire, and their empire obviously outlasted this. So while they lost in the United States, they lost the United States altogether, they didn't exactly lose the rest of the war, because now it's everywhere. But fighting in the Americas starts focusing more on the South. Remember, the British basically completely control New York, and Washington has been failing in Pennsylvania. So the war turned south. The British early on had taken Savannah, Georgia in 1778. And in 1780, the British besieged Charleston, the capital of South Carolina. So they're already starting to fight throughout it, and in the Southern Theater, the British are under the command of General Cornwallis. And the British are repeatedly having to get sucked into the hinterlands of the Carolinas, only to be fighting nasty British fights in the forests, where there's really no clear victors, except for the fact that frontiersmen end up being pretty good at running around British movements and picking them off, rather than doing full engagements. Remember, this is that whole Rangers thing, that it's guerrilla warfare. And that's what a lot of the Southern Theater looks like until Washington starts marching down there. But the U.S. actually went a bit on the offensive. For instance, in March of 1776, the U.S. had actually invaded Nassau, a British colony in the Caribbean. The privateers had been raiding throughout this time, and now with the French joining in, they're able to attack the British naval blockade of the American coast. Remember, a lot of American trade depends on that triangle trade, and so how can you pay for an army without that triangle trade? Because it was being blockaded by the British. The U.S. didn't have a significant enough navy to break that. But the French did, and the French really hammered the British. And broke a lot of these. The French even started trying to go on the offensive against Britain. In 1779, they teamed up with the Spanish to send a massive armada of 66 ships to try to invade England. But as we've seen with every Spanish armada before this, it kind of fails. But there was one minor clash, but most of the deaths came from bad seas. But this was by far the worst casualty event of the entire war, taking 8,000 sailors to their deaths. They also besieged Gibraltar, even attempt to invade the British island of Jersey, which is just off the coast of France, multiple times. With all of this going on, the British are starting to lose control, because Howe back in the northern colonies and central colonies, he had often chosen specifically to not pursue Washington. This is kind of a fatal flaw, because a lot of the time he could have easily broke them. He could have tried to take them while they were wintering in Valley Forge or something along those lines, and easily defeated the Continental Army. Now, Washington turned south, along with the support of two French generals, Marquis de Lafayette and Rochambeau. These two generals are leading a major force of French troops, who are also aided by the French being able to stop British blockades. And in the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French managed to secure the northern Virginia, where a town called Yorktown lies and is the headquarters of Cornwallis. And so in a three-pronged attack, particularly led by Marquis de Lafayette, the American and French forces managed to besiege Yorktown and take it, getting Cornwallis' surrender and basically ending the war in 1781. But the war continues for another couple of years in all of this outside stuff. For instance, the Spanish managed to take back Florida. Remember, Florida was technically British at this point because of the 7 Years' War. And there's a bunch of fighting in the Caribbean. Most of it not involving Americans, but will be a key component of how the negotiations to follow will be held. They also managed to raid English possessions on the Ivory Coast, Dutch South Africa. And Dutch actually end up aligning with the British. And basically every coast that the British have on Africa gets raided. There's fighting in India. In fact, there's an invasion of Sri Lanka. It's a world war. But the fighting starts to peter out in late 1782 and negotiations begin. In early 1782, Parliament voted to end the American theater. That's why they didn't try to reinvade. But that was in hopes that they could kind of ward off all of these attacks from the Spanish and French. They fail, and so in November of 1782, they finally draft the Treaty of Paris. Now, there's actually multiple treaties of Paris. One between the French, one between the French and English, one between the Spanish and English, and one, of course, between the U.S. and English, as well as one between the Dutch and all the other powers. The Dutch are kind of a weird wild card because they end up fighting against the English towards the end of the war. The Spanish managed to gain a few islands. The French and Florida, which will become quite a problem. The French gain some fishing rights in a few islands, but most importantly, the U.S. gains recognition by Britain. And that the territory is official, that U.S. territory extends all the way to the Mississippi. Of course, the British do gain some lands in India and basically kick off their empire in India that will make them one of the most powerful empires in the world for another century. So, with all of this, though, the war is a success, and the U.S. is officially independent, not just because the French recognize them, but now the British do. Next time, we'll talk about how that early republic kind of misses a few steps, but eventually gets a footing. We obviously see a few turning points in this war, right? You have the English constantly winning all the way until the French join in and all that. But I didn't really get to talk about Benedict Arnold and what happened to him. So the thing that you have to understand is that he gets relegated to like overseeing Philadelphia for a little bit, then he gets put in charge of a barracks that is now actually a pretty prominent military location, West Point, New York. And what happens there is that he keeps on getting passed over for promotion, partially because he can't even fight, but also he's scored some enemies in the process. Remember, he won Saratoga by defying orders, and he eventually just gets fed up with this and surrenders the garrison to the British. So, in exchange for hopefully becoming a general in their army, but he kind of is relegated to menial duty, and they don't respect him in any way. So, doesn't really help him But you can see his most important contributions are very much for that. So why do we remember him for his turncoats ways? You have all of these references to Arnold being a traitor, and yet he kind of saved the Union, right? Like he took Ticonderoga. He won the Battle of Lake Champlain. He won the Battle of Saratoga. Like, these are huge turning points in the war, and especially in those early ones, it's kind of the only victories the U.S. is getting. Well, Ticonderoga, there wasn't such a thing as the U.S. yet, but these are turning points of the war. And yet, why do we remember him for turning coat later on?
I think it might just be because at the time they might not have recognized the significance of those battles, maybe. And then if you help someone 100 times, but you don't help them one time, that one time is what they remember.
Yeah, it's definitely a memory problem, isn't it? Because, I mean, people definitely recognized that he contributed because, for instance, there's monuments to his leg all over the place. And some of them survive to this day. But, like, people were burning him in effigy in Boston as soon as this happened. Like, where's the forgiveness, right? So kind of a tragic figure. Any other ideas on why he might not be remembered so well?
Because people want to focus on the heroes of the story, and since he only won the few battles, and then the end he flipped, they kind of see him as more like an antagonist than a protagonist.
Yeah, well, it speaks to how we remember a lot of these figures, right? That we have American heroes that are, larger than life, but then as soon as one of them has something unforgivable, we dump them to the side in these stories. This happens all the time today, right? When, like, for instance, something that we've been seeing a lot with these protests recently is numerous statues coming down, including probably the person who is the most responsible for emancipation, General Grant, who was attacked for his anti-Semitism. Perhaps there's a lesson there that, all of these folks have some sort of foible. But I keep on saying Ben Franklin. Benedict Arnold is the one who took the step too far and joined the wrong side. But with these kinds of turning points, and talking about like historical memory and all that kind of stuff, why beyond the fact that they lead to the conclusion of the war, are they significant? Like if I on the test had you identify the significance of Saratoga, it's not just that, it's seen as a turning point, it did something, right? What did it do?
It's kind of like the domino effect. One falls, another one falls, and it creates a movement.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, it leads to something. What is that something?
Well, wasn't it a big boost in morale for the Continental Army?
Well, yeah, when you capture that many troops, what was it, 8,000, I believe? 6,000. When you capture 6,000 British troops, that's quite a morale booster. Though we'd already seen some turning point in terms of morale boosting even during Valley Forge, right? What else did it lead to?
And it allowed the French to see them as independent.
Exactly. The main reason why the Battle of Saratoga is seen as a turning point has nothing to do with its actual military importance. It has everything to do with its diplomatic importance, because that's what allowed the French to officially join in. Mind you, they'd already been doing some stuff like giving arms to the U.S. Navy, but they didn't recognize the U.S. until that point. So that's the big turning point, not because of the actual victory, but because of what it means. That's what a lot of these significance questions are about. It's not about, like identifying that this was a battle fought in upstate New York and, had Benedict Arnold win the day or whatever. It's more about what does it mean, right? What would be another good one? Because I want you guys to do well on the test, but if you only identify the thing by like its basic, it happened in X day and all that, like something that you can basically derive from Wikipedia, that's only half the grade. So if you're literally just using Wikipedia, you're only going to get an F. So let's see here. Yeah, that would be a good one. What would be the significance of Enlightenment radicalism?
It slightly influenced the Declaration of Independence because some of the Enlightenism was included in it, like happiness instead of property within the pursuit of happiness.
Well, it certainly gave the ideas, right? But that's just the Enlightenment in itself. What's the difference between Enlightenment and Enlightenment radicalism?
Well, I feel like, I guess the common trend with radicalism is it tends to be the, like out of the norm as opposed to culture in in a political climate like that. So by Enlightenment radicalism starting to become more of the main culture surrounding all of the colonies and that idea of rebellion, that made an impact in the fact that it wasn't the counterculture anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's that it was informing rebellion, that it was actually encouraging rebellion, right? That's really what makes something radical, right? As opposed to just, extreme or, prominent or anything along those lines. Radicalism, when it comes to ideology, is more about rebellion against the status quo. Because a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers were quite opposed to such crazy stuff as a revolution. And mind you, the French would feel the pain of this Enlightenment radicalism themselves only a decade after this war ends. In 1789, the French Revolution begins, and it turns particularly brutal. So you have all of that kind of stuff going on with Enlightenment radicalism. But how can you say it in just like a sentence what it was and why it's significant to American history?
Because it introduced the widespread idea of rebellion.
Yeah, basically. I mean, there's many other answers, right? There's not just one. The main idea is that you want to be thinking about, why does this matter in the context of American history? It could just be, why does it matter to you today? After all of these things, everything we talked about is the formation of the United States. So basically, we're here because of this. But there's also thinking about how it affects later events, thinking about its greater meaning to American history when talking about like rebellion and fomenting rebellion. You can also talk about like the connections, like who were the radicals of the American Revolution.
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine, definitely, yeah. He was quite the radical, although, funny enough, he'd end up moving back to Britain, back to London, in 1787, I think it is. Somewhere around there, 1786, 1787. And then causing trouble up there, and because he started defending the French Revolution, and decided to go join the French Revolution in 1791, and almost faced the guillotine himself for an entire year until he was finally negotiated back to the United States by American ambassadors. So he has quite the tumultuous life after this, and very much because of his radicalism. But what group, like even before all this ideological stuff, all this Enlightenment radicalism, what other group could be considered the radicals of the American Revolution? Not really radicals of the Enlightenment, but we talked about them.
The Sons of
Yes,
Liberty.
Sons of Liberty, yes. And why is that?
Because they use their means of making their voices heard tend to be very, very, very aggressive, very destructive,
Yeah.
and radical means of getting their ideas heard.
Yeah. So, what role does radicalism play today? I know that one's a bit tough.
It's
But-
12:15.
It's 12:15?
Yeah.
Well, you can see it's playing out, right? There's a lot of radicalism today. Who knows what will work out, right? Who knows what's legitimate radicalism and who knows what it isn't. Now we've got more than 200 years of history between all of this and today, and there will be plenty to go off of in terms of changing how we protest, how we expect people to behave even when being radicals. But this is kind of where it starts in the U.S., right? So it's not just important in terms of the creation of the United States, it's also important in terms of how we think about ourselves, how we act, and how we protest, and how we enact change. So have a good day, and I'll see you all next time.